What's up, everyone? It's Dakota, and welcome back to another Modern video. And the One Ring has been dominating the Modern format. It's seeing the most play of any other card that is available in the format, and usually that spot is reserved for lands because of like the overlap in different decks and the fact that most of the time you see fetch lands being the main play set in any given deck, aside from like the namesake card, which of course doesn't really share much overlap with any of the other decks in the format. So that's just to kind of put into perspective that the One Ring seems like it's the kind of go-to card for competitive players currently in this RCQ season and how people want to tackle the Modern format. However, there are a few decks in the format that do not require you to play any copies of the One Ring. So if you're at home looking at your ringless binder, don't worry about it. There are a few decks that you can play that have competitive success in the format currently that you can take to your RCQ and hopefully take it down and qualify for either the regional championship in North Carolina or in Portland coming up early next year. Of course, before we get too deep into the video and we talk about some of these amazing decks that you can play without the One Ring, if you're already subscribed to the channel and you want to see more videos from me where we post a lot of content based on the Modern and Pioneer format with the potential to kind of branch out into Standard and doing some other longer form content. So if any of that interests you, please consider subscribing, ringing that notification bell, all that fun stuff. It's a free, easy way to support me and my content. And if you want to support me even further, I have a few links in the description down below where I have one to my Discord server if that's something that interests you. I also have my Twitter handle down there. And the first and new sponsor for the channel in Mana Traders. If you have any interest in playing any of these decks, but you don't have a Mana Traders account, you can use my link down below to sign up for a Mana Traders account. You can swap out decks at your leisure, and you know, they've only been adding improvements to the site as time has went on. I've had my own personal subscription as of right now for going on like 3 years, and even before then I had my I had an account for probably about 2 years before that. So I've been kind of on and off in Mana Traders for about 5 years. Love the service. They do a lot of good improvements, even like instant trading now, which is pretty sweet. So if you want to, you know, get into Mana Traders, you want to start playing online, you want to start taking like playtesting a little bit more seriously, and you don't want to have the commitment of trying to play a deck and then try to trade it around and hope that you can kind of get the pieces for another deck, just go ahead, sign up for Mana Traders. It's awesome. You get to rent whatever decks that you want. And yeah, it's a great service, and it's what I use on the channel a lot, so I can't recommend them enough. But with all that said, let's go ahead and check out some of these decks for the Modern format. So up first, we have probably the most played deck in the format currently that is not playing the One Ring in Dimir Merktide. This deck is pretty straightforward. It is a blue-black control deck that is essentially going to kind of tempo out your opponent. It's got some pretty neat answers in the deck as a whole. We see like one Toxic Deluge here for the decks that kind of want to go wide. We have Sink into Stupor that's going to double as a land and be a pseudo counterspell. You see Force of Negation, Archmage's Charm, these being like actual counterspells. Force just being a card that you can play for free on your opponent's turn if you have another blue card to pitch to it. The full play set of counterspell. Spell Snare to kind of help out when you're on the draw. Spell Pierces, Preordain, Fatal Push, Cling to Dust. You know, nothing too fancy here, but the real like punishment that this deck can dish out is with Psychic Frog and Merktide Regent kind of backing each other up. Kind of like the Milo and Otis of our generation. Psychic Frog comes down on turn 2, or, you know, played on like turn 3, leave up like Spell Pierce or Spell Snare or something of that nature. And then this creature can pretty easily avoid damage-based removal as long as you have, you know, at least a few cards in hand. You're going to be able to discard them to the frog, put +1/+1 counters on them. Then you're able to exile 3 cards from your graveyard to give it flying. Also, you can fly over your opponent's threats to hopefully deal damage to them and then get to draw a card while simultaneously, again, putting pressure on their life total. This, however, combos pretty well with Merktide Regent. Obviously, during a discard cards, put them in your graveyard, you end up getting to pay Merktide Regent's delve cost, making it essentially 2 blue for a flying threat. And then also, if you just get to discard maybe some instants and sorceries that don't really affect like the board or anything, like you're playing against like another control deck, probably getting rid of some other redundant removal spells, or maybe there's like expensive counter spells that you don't necessarily want, what have you. Just an example. You're able to obviously get more counters on Merktide Regent. But the last ability on Psychic Frog also really helps out Merktide Regent, because exiling 3 cards from your graveyard means that if you exile any instants and sorceries, we'll say 3 in this case, you'll end up putting 3 more +1/+1 counters on a Merktide Regent. It's going to ideally be an 11/11. You're going to have probably at least a 3, 4, 5 power Psychic Frog, and that is a ton of damage. If you already got into a hit with a Psychic Frog, you're going to play this, you're going to again have it up to like 4 power, and then you have an 11 power Merktide. That's 15 damage coming across. If your opponent's fetched at any point or shocked in a shock land, anything like that, they've tripped getting back into their seat after a bathroom break, they're already dead. The game is over. And this deck is able to kind of leverage not playing the One Ring for the fact that it is able to kind of close out the game very early. And you'll kind of notice that with some of the decks on here, is that they have that mode where they can either kind of get underneath of a ring. This deck, less likely to do that because, again, Psychic Frog, you have to then discard cards too, and you also have to get in a Merktide Regent. While it is possible that you could Psychic Frog, discard your whole hand except for a Merktide Regent, play a Merktide Regent and leave up like a counter spell of some sort after you play it, and then like turn 4 hit your opponent for a bunch of damage. That is a possibility of something that could happen, but that's not typically how these games are going to play out. You're going to end up playing a very grindy game. We see like Harbinger of the Seas here as well, being a card that a lot of modern players have kind of started going towards, because it's way more annoying to turn your opponent's lands into islands than it is mountains. And, it's in a color that notoriously has a pretty difficult time, like really having, a hard answer to something like Harbinger of the Seas. So this is a kind of a card that some of these blue decks have kind of gravitated towards. And of course you have a suite of, very efficient, counter magic in just actual factual counterspell, spell snare, spell pierce, all that kind of stuff. You can just kind of like tempo your opponent out of the game. You can play this kind of tempo style, or you can play as a control deck, and it kind of like flips that gear and can just end game super quickly. So that is blue-black Merktide. This is probably the one that I would recommend to a lot of players if you're not already playing if you're not already playing a One Ring deck, just for the fact that there's a lot of versatility in what's going on here. And just like control decks, like this has a way to kind of close out the game. And Psychic Frog is honestly like going to be like my lifelong companion. Like once like Yawgmoth is finally unplayable, I'm definitely switching to the Frog or finding a way to play Frog in the in Yawgmoth. But yeah, that's going to be our first deck. That's Dimir Merktide. Let's go ahead and take a look at our second ringless deck in the format. Next on our list, we have everybody's favorite modern archetype in Ruby Storm. So the Storm decks don't really need the One Ring for the fact that, it's just trying to win the game as fast as possible. It's a deck that can win the game on turn 2. More than likely, you're going to end up winning the game on like turn 3, and there's a decent amount of setup. It's probably one of the best, if not the best, game 1 decks in the format. You just got to try to get a little lucky to win some of the sideboard games. And so, if you're feeling pretty lucky, Ruby Storm is a very solid option here. You have a bunch of cost reducers in for Ruby Medallion and for Raoul Monsoon Mage. Raoul Monsoon Mage also doubling as a way to kind of keep extending your combo out and going, because you're going to need to cast at least 20 spells or find multiple grape shots and, flash them back to be able to kill your opponent. You're playing a plethora of rituals in like Desperate Ritual and Pyretic Ritual and Manamorphose, which Manamorphose will net you mana if you have any of your cost reducers in play. Striker Rich kind of helps sets up those turn 2 kills. And with things like Wish in your main board, which allow you to play a card that you own from outside of the game, you have answers with things like Nature's Claim to blow up some problematic artifacts and enchantments. You have a Braids to do the same thing with other artifacts. Mainly these cards will come into play after sideboarding, but you can go and find the aforementioned Grape Shot to be able to kill your opponent, Pyroclasm to sweep the board if you need it, Alchemist Gambit to actually help you play around One Ring protection, even though you also need to kind of circle back and go get and empty the Warrens to be able to stop the damage from being prevented, or if you somehow can just deal more damage to your opponent, which really isn't possible because you need a target with Grape Shot, and they still technically have protection, even though the damage part of their protection is prevented by your Alchemist Gambit. We also see a Mind Collapse here, which means that you can just sacrifice a mountain, deal 5 to a problematic creature or planeswalker, Past in Flames to kind of like fire all these different kinds of Impulse effects and Reckless Impulse and Ren's Resolve, even Glimpse the Impossible, or getting these rituals as well to generate even more mana to cast all of these kind of pseudo draw spells to find a way to close out the game from there. It's a deck that goes fast. It gets around the ring protection in some pretty neat ways, and in general is just honestly like a very fun deck to play. It's not the easiest. Trust me, like I won all my game ones at an RCQ and in 4 rounds, and then I think won like one sideboarded game, which, partially probably due to bad play. Also the fact that there's some games where like my opponents had a lot of hate pieces in play, where it's kind of easy to play around one in some ways. And then in a lot of ways, when they just have 2, 3, 4 hate pieces, you're just probably never winning that game, which is why I have the caveat that you have to get kind of lucky in those sideboarded games to try to win. But nonetheless, this deck is just so fast that a lot of the times, if you win game 1 and you lose game 2, you can just be on the play in game 3, and then short of some like turn 0 interactions, you're going to be able to hopefully go off before your opponent is able to even put any sort of dampening sphere or trinisphere or something like that into play, to where you're just going to be able to cast a bunch of spells and then grip shot them for 20, or if you're just into styling on them, going up to 40 spells and then playing and empty the warrens for 42, passing the turn back, and them just playing their second land and conceding the game. So Ruby Storm, a fun deck to play, great game 1 deck, and most importantly, doesn't need no stinking One Ring to be a viable deck in the format. And please do not even try to like stick the One Ring in this deck. I am begging you. If the format gets to the point where Storm is playing the One Ring, I might just eat my chair. So the last deck we're going to look at is a deck that I haven't really been putting any respect on its name, and I probably need to now, because Domain Zoo is been a deck that's been, I would say, towards like middle of the pack. Like I think it was definitely a deck that you could catch some people off guard and you could just win the game like right out of the gate if they, especially if they stumble. But a lot of the times too, if they try to kind of grind you out, Domain's just going to keep punching you with, 2 mana 5/5s and 2 mana 4/4s that are just going to have just a brick of text in a format where like targeted removal is king. Of course, now we see things like Toxic Deluge into the format, where sure, like a lot of the decks, you can just pay 1 or 2 life and kill a lot of their creatures. But in this deck in particular, you're not going to get that luxury. Territorial Kavu, again, is a 5/5. Blage, one of the best creatures printed in Modern Horizons 3, is also, you have to pay 6 to be able to get rid of this, and it's just going to potentially come back later. Scion of Draco, 4 power and toughness, so you're going to have to pay at least 4 life, in a deck that is going to be putting pressure on you early and often. Ragavan in this deck was once considered one of the best creatures in Modern, probably one of the best creatures of all time. Basically dropped from a lot of other decks in the format in favor of things like Ocelot Pride and like Guide of Souls and things like that. But the full 4 here, just because again, like you play this on turn 1, you can just kind of snowball your advantage and just absolutely decimate some players with this. And then a pretty simple package of non-creature spells here in 4 Lightning Bolt, 4 Stubborn Denial, which most of the time is just going to be a 1 mana negate, 4 Tribal Flames to just deal 5 to the dome, or, to another creature if you really need to. And then, of course, Leyline Binding to just kind of deal with any other problematic permanents your opponent plays, including the One Ring. Yeah, the One Ring protection definitely sucks when you are this beatdown deck, but when your creatures are so big, you don't need to attack over the course of, 3, 4, 5 turns, where, giving your opponent that extra turn and extending it out to, again, if you have a 2-turn clock, a 3-turn clock, this deck is just immediately saying like, okay, you can have the protection for that turn, but I'm going to have answers for your ring when they come down. And you still need to, in those 3 cards that you're going to end up drawing, find a way to not die to my board. Also, by the way, I'm playing Orcish Bowmaster in my deck, so if you choose to use the One Ring, you're going to at least take a little bit of damage. Maybe not the first time you activate it, but definitely the second time you're going to be taking some damage. And of course, you're going to make my Orc army even bigger, and when I have a Scion or Draco in play, like it's just another big threat that you have to try to deal with. That isn't going to be blocked very nicely when it has, hexproof, lifelink, first strike, trample, and vigilance. So it's like this deck is just annoying to try to deal with because it gets around a lot of the, the best removal spells in the format, which are the targeted removal spells from things like Galvanic Discharge, where we have things like Leyline Binding, not Leyline Guild Pack, Leyline Binding. We have Fatal Push. We have people still playing Lightning Bolt. Maybe like the rare case where people are playing like Unholy Heat, which has the potential to deal 6 damage to something. This deck just has like a mode where it gets to bypass all that. And even when it doesn't, getting to kind of curve out, Ragavant into like a Scion Draco, into something like a Flage to, end up kind of controlling the board, continuing to press in damage, playing Territorial Kavus, kind of getting to filter out your draws to get rid of some of those redundant lands to hopefully draw some spells like Tribal Flames. And again, when you get to your opponent down to, 4 or 5 life and they somehow stop you from attacking, Tribal Flames does end the game very, very quickly. It's one of those spells that you can't really account for just because it does deal so much damage. I mean, of course you can account for it, but a lot of the time you're going to be in a, well, if they have it kind of situation, because you're just getting beat down by 4 4s and 5 5s and 6 6s. So, and also the fact that it is a 5-color deck gets some pretty powerful sideboard cards as well, and like Consign to Memory being a really good one, Soul Guide Lantern, Surgical Extraction, Damping Sphere being a really, really good one, and Rust in Peace as well, on top of Insidian Charmaw as well for some of the other like colorless decks where getting an Ugin's Labyrinth and tagging that when they still have a creature underneath of it, or rather a 7-cost colorless card underneath of it, means that they end up getting truly 2-for-1, because now they're down the land and they can never get that card back from exile, which is really nice for this deck, and just another reason to play it. And again, no rings in sight here. This deck doesn't need it. Again, it's just so low to the ground. It can end games fairly quickly, and even when your opponent does kind of play the one ring, you're forcing them to kind of chain rings together, but they're also going to be taking damage potentially from one or multiple Bowmasters. They're essentially drawing dead if they never find like a board wipe, or continue to play rings and then finding a way to win after spending 4 mana to gain protection and everything like that. Because all the creatures on board are essentially going to be full. But yeah, those are my 3 decks for the modern format that do not play the one ring. So if you're ever kind of depressed the fact that like, oh, I don't have $1,000 sitting in the bank to buy my playset of the one ring, well, here's a few decks that you can play. You can find some success in the format. Of course, you are definitely going to need to put the time and reps in, as we always talk about with picking up any deck. A lot of these decks are just not that easy to kind of pick up and play. I don't even believe like the Domain deck is like that easy. There's definitely a lot of things that you need to keep in mind and consider, when playing these decks. And, if you want to have success, you don't need to spend a ton of money on, a playset of a specific card that is more than likely going to be banned in December. You can play these decks for the time being and still get those W's and hopefully qualify for your regional championship coming in March. But that's gonna do for me this video. Hope you all enjoyed it. If you did, leave a like on the video. Comment down below if there's any other decks that you have been enjoying in the format that are not playing the one ring, or if you just want to see the one ring thrown into the sun. I know I'm in that camp. I hope Elon Musk puts one in a SpaceX rocket and we finally just get to launch it into the sun, because I think that would be pretty sweet, honestly. Good use of a billionaire's money. But yeah, that's gonna be this video. Hope you all enjoyed it. Check out the links in the description below, all that fun stuff, and I'll catch y'all later.